Hi, I'm Terry Burns, and this is another of my short wordplay videos related to my class on John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, or Hieroglyphic Monad, based on the translation Dr. Nancy Turner and I did a couple years ago. So we're up in the class I'm teaching, playlist for that below, up to Theorem 17, and that's when Dee gives this unusual association with the Philosopher's Stone. What he says, in effect, is that 252 is the number of the Philosopher's Stone. And then he makes up a Latin word, Tyranibus, which we translated as Tyrian, which is our made up English word. So maybe knowing what a Kabbalistic Tyrian is will help us figure out why John Dee thinks 252 is the number of the Philosopher's Stone. Let's see. Okay, like my whole class on the hieroglyphic monad, which again, the playlist for that's below. I'm assuming you know who John Dee is. I'm assuming you know what the hieroglyphic monad is, and it actually would be very useful if you'd read the hieroglyphic monad and you were up to Theorem 17, where you first get this association. Because in Theorem 17, and then later on in Theorem 23, he's going to equate 252 with the Philosopher's Stone. Now, that begs the question of why? Why of all numbers, 252? And then he gives us a sort of strange explanation and tells us he's leaving out two others for brevity, probably knowing those other explanations would help. So we're going to see if we can come up with them and see if we can figure out what a Kabbalistic Tyrian is. And in the process, this may tell us something about his knowledge of physical alchemy and of the Kabbalah. So just a quick snippet from Theorem 17. He has talked about lots and lots of things. If you're in my class, you know what they are, but if not, we'll skip over them. He says, from all these things, it can be concluded that by means of a Kabbalistic explanation, our cross, the cross of the elements, the cross associated with Tiferet, the light of the cross, the central symbol of his whole set of theorems, can signify to initiates in a remarkable shortened way the number 252. And then he tells you how. He says, namely, 4 times 5, 4 times 50, 10, 21, and 1 add up to 252, which you can do that math yourself. It's like, yeah, that's true, but that seems kind of arbitrary, right? Well, he goes on then and says, we recommend to Kabbalistic Tyrians that they study this same number, for we can yet deduce it from our premises in 2 other ways omitted here for brevity. Well, C.H. Jostyn back in 1964 in his scholarly translation came up with one of those ways, which is if you keep squaring and then cubing and then raise to the power of 4, then to the power of 5, then to the power of 6, and to the power of 7, the number 2, you get 252, which is really cool. Although, I mean, they have to add up to something. So even though that's kind of amazing, why does that tell us, what does that tell us about the Philosopher's Stone, that that's how you square numbers? Or how does that help change the form of something, or recreate a universe once it's fallen, which is his big project here? So maybe we need an explanation, it would seem, connected to Kabbalistic Tyrians. And one reason is whenever Dee is making up words in Latin, which he does a lot, he's usually doing it for some significant reason. I'll put in the wordplay playlist below, but he's done this in the letter to Maximilian with Gamea, Gammus Gaian. Later, he does it with Pyronomic. He does this many times, and that's along with his other condensed wordplay of things like stillbone related to Mercury and Hermes and many other things like that. So in Latin, Tyrians, he writes Tyranibus. Jostyn, again, back in 64, translated that as beginner, and even Jostyn didn't quite believe that meaning. As he pointed out, that makes syntactic and grammatical sense, Tiro plus ibus in Latin, if you assume that Dee has misspelled Tiro and spelled it with a Y. But since we're talking about the Philosopher's Stone, and this has just followed the signs of the adept LVX back in Theorem 16, it hardly seems like it's a thing for beginners to be messing around with. So more likely, the word nods at several different meanings of Tyr, which is an ancient Phoenician city, sometimes called Tyr, Tyre, Tyros. The name of that means rock or stone. Phoenicia, of course, might remind us too of ancient Phoenicia, the birthplace of the alphabet. But in terms of alchemy, Tyr was renowned for its purple dye. The Tyrian dye is associated with royalty. It's referred to in alchemical works like the Turba Philosophorum and the 4 books of the Suda Democritus, which Dee has alluded to in earlier theorems with his writing out in Greek, nature rejoices nature and things like that. But it could just as easily be Tyr, the Old Norse god associated with Mars, where we get our Tuesday from. But most likely, we're looking at Tyronibus punning upon Tyr plus omnibus, that rock, Tyr, which contains all, omnibus. That seems like a pretty good description of the Philosopher's Stone. So if we take Tyr omnibus, which Dr. Turner and I translated as Tyrians, a rock which contains all, or a person who is pursuing a rock that contains all, people seeking the Philosopher's Stone, and you put Kabbalistic before it, basically a Kabbalistic Tyrian is someone who pursues the secret of the Philosopher's Stone by studying the Kabbalah. And since the Sefer Yetzirah describes the formation of the word, perhaps that's a good place to start. And of course, this has been obscured for 400 years, largely by people insisting that Dee didn't have access to the Sefer Yetzirah, which I hope I've shown in other videos he did, and how he would have had access to it. And even if we didn't know how he had access to it, it's kind of hard to understand the hieroglyphic monad otherwise. So in the Sefer Yetzirah, the world, including the planets, the elements, and everything else, things that we've had multiple correspondences even by Theorem 16 and 17, and by the time we get to Theorem 23, there will be even more. All of those things are created by the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So basically, and this is kind of awesome, that's what he's referring to. So remember, there's 3 mother letters in Hebrew, there's 7 doubles. Dee has played with the construction of things with 3 times 7 a bunch of times. You know this if you studied the monad. He's related them to the denary, not just to things like the Tetractys, but also to the 10 Sephiroth. And that's a big part of what he has done up to this point. So now we have our 3 meanings. Here's the first one that seems kind of arbitrary, the second one, which is cool, but doesn't shed a whole lot of light on the monad, and then the third one, because I've only talked about the mother letters and the doubles. There's 3 mothers, 7 doubles, but there's also 12 simples. So he's just been doing 3 times 7. If we put the simples or singles in, that's 252. So Dee is equating 252 on the Philosopher's Stone to basically the entire Hebrew alphabet, which to a Kabbalist is the entire represented powers of creation. Now that, I would say, is a Philosopher's Stone, the entire represented powers of creation. By the way, he'll get back to this in Theorem 23. Those of you that have a copy of our translation know there's this diagram. Actually, it's in every translation. And when you get down to the master number or magisterial that's associated with stones and fermentation, that's 252. If you want to join in, we'll eventually get to that theorem in my class on the hieroglyphic monad, and you're certainly welcome to join us. But that's the wordplay I've got for you today. Now you can tell people you know what John Dee thinks the Philosopher's Stone is. It's 252, and it's 252 because it's the entire represented powers of creation, which I would submit is one heck of a Philosopher's Stone. Okay. Have a great day. Bye-bye.